Okay, everybody, let's see how this works out. So you should be able to hear me now. Hopefully that's the case. We're going to give everybody a couple minutes to get connected, and we will start shortly. So right now you should just see my computer screen with my mouse moving, and you should be able to hear me. Hey, while we're waiting, let's test out this chat. So I'll type something. You guys there. Let's see if anybody's out there. So if you've clicked on the, well, I guess you're not hearing this if you've clicked on the link and it says that it's not available, but that may have happened to some of you the first time you tried to click the link, but the stream should be active now, so there shouldn't be an issue. Sweet. Looks like we got a few of you here. So again, we'll give everybody just a couple minutes and then we'll get going. The funny thing I'm finding is if I type in the chat, like I have the chat open in two windows, if I look at where the stream is going, I don't see your comments, but if I look at the stream pulled up in another window, then I can see you guys. So kind of strange. It's echoing your every word for me. Are other people having sound issues? Like it sounds echoey? I'm assuming that's what you mean, Jonah. This is weird. I hate YouTube live videos because people sit there and talk about, hey, shout out to so-and-so from so-and-so place. But I see why they do that now because it's awkward just to sit here and watch people log on. Sweet. Whoever this Sir 1416 is has no echo. This is scary because I don't know what your guys' usernames are. You guys could say anything and I don't know who it is talking to me. Cool. Sounds like it's working for most of you. We'll give everybody one more minute and then we'll get going. This is fun. My favorite part about this is I don't have to drive to UVU. So hopefully you guys are enjoying this being at home too. And I hope nobody's in the classroom. In fact, I should text Reese really quick and tell him if anybody's in the room to send them away. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so everybody should be able to see and hear me. Sounds like we're having good success on this. So I will try and watch the chat. Let me actually change my window layout just a little bit. So if something happens, shout out in the chat and I should be able to interact with you guys somewhat. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is related to that whole idea of crop factor and sensor size. So we talked a little bit about, in fact, let me pull up the website. And we'll make this a little bigger. So if I come into choosing a camera and then sensor size and crop factor. Okay, so I gave you this little illustration down here of an image that's projected by a lens onto an image sensor, right? So if you guys remember the full frame image sensor, right, like the 35 millimeter full frame equivalent, was this right here, right, this red one on the outside, and then the APS crop, or the 1.5 crop, was this inside blue frame, right? So we talked about up here at the top, if you have a lens that is projecting a circle that's larger than your sensor, it doesn't matter, right? All you effectively get is seeing less of that circle. But what I wanted to show you guys visually is what happens if you have a sensor that's the sensor itself is larger than the image circle of the lens projection. So in this case, what if your sensor was in this area that I'm outlining with my mouse, right? And I already gave away the punchline here. You know what's going to happen, but I think it'll be helpful for some of you that have never seen this to actually be able to get kind of a visual of what it looks like. So if I come back to me, right now I have the camera set up. And if in fact, I'll go completely wide on the lens so you guys can see this even more strong. Let me chat Reese back really quickly. Today as well. Okay. Let me just make sure we've got one Canvas message. I need to respond to somebody. Okay, back. Okay, so if you look at this, I have the camera set up right now, and there's two different modes that this camera can shoot in. So this is a mirrorless camera. It's a Sony a7 III. Right now, I'm using it in one of two different modes, right? There's the mode that uses the full sensor, the full frame mode, and there's the cropped mode. So if I come over to here, and again, I'm going to zoom it out just a little bit so you can see. You'll notice this effect at the widest point of the lens. So okay, so now you should be able to see I have a function button on the camera assigned to trigger between the two modes, the full frame mode and then the cropped mode. So before I was shooting with a cropped lens, right, an APS lens that doesn't cover the full frame. So this is what that looks like. So if you look around the edges of the frame, right, like this is hard because I have to do this backwards and I suck at doing that. Anyway, if you look around the edges of the frame, right, then you can see a bunch of black, right, that vignetting on the edges. So that's basically showing you what, like in real life, what the actual lens circle looks like. So this is an APS lens projecting onto a full frame camera. So a lot of cameras won't let you actually do this, right? We talked about the Canon cameras before. With the Canon cameras that I'd showed you previously, I think I've still got them. So like the 5D and then that other smaller Canon T2i. So with those ones, in order to put an EFS lens, which is what Canon calls their cropped lens, in order to put that onto this 5D, I actually had to saw the back of the lens off with a hacksaw. So it's doable, but it's not, it doesn't come from the manufacturer that way. So with Sony, it's really nice because it's an E-mount no matter what. There's no difference between the cropped lens mount and then the full frame lens mount. Same thing with Nikon. Like you can put a DX cropped lens on a full frame camera and then just choose the mode, which basically just takes the center of the sensor and records that in the cropped mode. So yeah, hopefully this gives you a little bit of a visual so you can see that vignetting, right? The black around the edges of the frame. And the other thing I want to talk about while we have this pulled up is you'll also notice when I jump back into that cropped mode and I just take the center of the image here, that mode is going to give a lot better image quality because the image actually degrades as it goes towards the edges of the frame. So this isn't something you're going to be able to see with the YouTube compression, but in the middle the lens is usually sharpest, and then as you progress out to the edges of the frame it gets softer and softer. So just pay attention to that when I switch this back. Watch how much the crop happens. It crops in more than you'd think it would. And you'll notice that the vignetting, that darkness on the edges of the frame, you'll actually still be able to see a little bit of that fall off, a little bit of darkening towards the edges. Because again, it's not like the lens projects this rectangle of where the sensor is and it's projecting and then suddenly 1 pixel later it's black, right? You have this natural fall off of the image circle of the lens on the edges of the circle. So that's why with a lot of lenses you'll have vignetting. Even though you can see the entire image, you'll still see it get darker towards the edges of the frame. So that's what vignetting looks like. Again, this is an extreme example. You won't usually see vignetting this bad if you're using the right combination of lens and camera. But yeah, it can be a really useful thing. The reason I have it set to a function button on the camera, which means it's just a dedicated button where I can press the button and then something happens. The reason I sacrifice one of my function buttons for this sensor crop is because it effectively gives you two lenses. So if I put a 50mm lens on this camera, as soon as I press that center crop sampling button, I suddenly have like a 75mm lens, which is a nice kind of portrait type focal length. So with one lens mounted to the camera, I can basically have two lenses, two focal lengths, without having to switch between lenses physically. So that's what that looks like. Hopefully that makes sense. And now I'm gonna push the button. It'll switch back to sampling an APS size, and we'll continue on. So now you shouldn't see any vignetting anymore. And we're back in business. And then I'm gonna zoom it in just a little bit. Okay. There we go. Good enough. Okay. So any questions on that, like sensor size thing? If you have them, send them in the chat, and I can follow up with it a little bit more once the chat actually catches up with real time. So I'm going to switch back to my screen, and we will carry on with our conversation from yesterday. So we talked a little bit about these artistic tools of a photographer yesterday. Mainly composition, right? That's pretty much all we got through. So I want to carry on with depth of field here and show you a couple practical examples of what depth of field looks like. So before we read through any of this, in fact, I'm not sure if we even will read this, I want to just give you a really general definition of what depth of field is, because it can get fairly complex, but it's really quite simple. So I hope for the purposes of this class that it doesn't seem like an intimidating concept. I hope it's something that you find easy to grasp and to apply. So like I talked about before, your depth of field is simply how much of your image is in acceptable focus, right? I talked about focus as being an infinitely thin plane. So there's really only one tiny sliver of an area in your image that's in focus. And then the focus is falling off behind that point and in front of that point. So I'm going to do this because I think this will be an easy way to demonstrate it. If you scroll down, there are a couple different resources at the bottom of this. So this depth of field simulator is a really nice one. So I'm going to open that up in a new tab here. And there's a couple things you can do with this. So you can agree to the GDPR. So there's lots of cell phone apps and things that give you this same functionality. So this is just a web browser version of a depth of field calculator. But I'm going to use it just to make our kind of visual understanding of this principle a little bit easier. So in this case, if you look down here at the bottom, we have the photographer represented by this guy here on the left, right? The camera location. And this guy you can move to be exactly where you want relative to the subject, right? So this lady is our subject. So if I take this lady and put her clear out, oh, somebody subscribed. How wonderful. I don't have anything on my YouTube channel, by the way, you guys. I have educational stuff like tutorials and things that I am going to start putting on the YouTube channel. But right now they're just strictly through my site, so I don't have them like publicly listed. So yeah, so hopefully I put something up so that you guys that are subscribing now actually have something to look at. Okay, so if I change the subject relative to the position of the photographer, a couple things happen, right? Obviously, she gets bigger in the frame, right? So if I come clear up here to where they're uncomfortably close, then you can see she's really big in the frame, right? If I come clear back here, then back here at like 17 meters, right? She's really small in the frame, and she's floating atop this wonderful backdrop. So watch what else happens though as she moves. So watch the background now instead of watching her, right? As she gets closer to the camera, you see this blur gets stronger and stronger, right? And as she gets farther away, the blur gets less and less apparent, right? So this is what our depth of field is, right? It's that area of acceptable focus. So if you see right here, this line is actually blue. It's kind of hard to see. Let me change that one thing again so you guys can see my cursor a little, or my zoom in of my cursor a little bit more clearly. So I'll bring this over here. Alrighty. Okay, so again, for those of you that weren't present last time we did this, I do have my keyboard shortcuts, like everything I'm pressing on the keyboard shows up in the lower right here. And then when I'm zooming in on an area to show you guys, a little magnifier window will appear above that. So right here, you can see this blue line, right, showing you that in front of the subject right here. So this is the subject. This red line is that infinitely thin plane of focus that we talked about. So this is the area of perfect focus, right? And then as we come forward, this is the point at which your focus will start to fall off. So from here to the photographer over here, that's going to be out of focus. And then from behind the subject to infinity is also going to be out of focus. So, so this is that range of acceptable focus, right? This is our depth of field. So as I move this forward, you can see that depth of field is shrinking, right? It's a shallow depth of field. That's the term you'll hear me use over and over again when I talk about a narrow depth of field or a shallow depth of field. This is what I mean. Not very much stuff is in focus, right? As we push the subject back, you can see the depth of field is growing, right? It's much broader. So this is a deep depth of field. Okay, so that's pretty much all that I'll require you to understand about depth of field for this class, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what changes that depth of field, what affects that depth of field, and then some misconceptions about depth of field. So first of all, let's explore this calculator a little bit more, and because you guys will find this really useful as you go to take your own shots. So so if you look up here, so there's basic and advanced modes. We're not going to get into advanced. We'll just stick with basic. You can change the person, your model, right? The appearance of the model. We'll just stick with the default. And with Paris, because that feels classy of us. So right here, you can see in the camera, we can pick the sensor size, right? So obviously that's going to matter because the sensor size, as you guys well know by now, is going to determine how much you can see, right, of the image circle that's being projected. So you can see the crop right here, 1.0. You guys know exactly what that means now, right? Because this is full frame, we have no crop. It's a crop of 1. 1 times anything is the thing you're multiplying it by, right? So now you guys know what APS-C means. If I come in here and click APS-C, we now have that 1.5 sensor crop that I talked about, and you saw that the image zoomed in effectively, right? So if I come back to 35 millimeter, this is what a full frame camera would give you, right? And then this is what the crop sensor lens and camera would give you. So when you're trying to determine your depth of field, it's very important to input these settings correctly because that field of view is going to affect your depth of field pretty massively. So you can see this little tip right here. The sensor size can also be set by choosing a camera from the database. So most of these depth of field calculators will give you the option to come in and say, okay, I'm shooting with a Canon camera and it's a 1DS Mark III, right? So if you prefer to work this way, that's kind of the idiot-proof way of creating your crop factor. A lot of times I think it's easier just to know your sensor size and then plug it in directly. However you want to work is up to you. Okay, so with that properly set up, we can now come in here and say, okay, this is the focal length I'm shooting on, right? In this case, it's an 85 millimeter lens, right? And then this is the aperture setting I'm using. This is how open the lens is. So because of how I've restructured this class, we're going to talk about exposure next week, and then we'll get into more depth on the aperture setting. But we can't talk about depth of field without discussing aperture at the same time, because the big thing to remember is that the wider open your aperture is, right, the larger that opening, the shallower your depth of field. So if you look over here, we have f1.4, and again, we'll talk about this later, but the smaller this number is, the larger the opening of your aperture is. So in photography, when you interact with the aperture, you interact with it by controlling this f number. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because you think, oh, I want a wide open aperture, I want a bigger number, but in reality, you actually want a smaller number. So again, remember, the smaller the f number, the wider open the aperture actually is. So if I come over here and I start dragging on this, you'll see, so watch as I drag this slider up here, watch what happens to this area down here, right? This depth of field. So I'm pushing this f number to be a larger number, right? So f45, right? And you can see my depth of field is growing wider and wider and wider, more and more deep, right, as I increase this f number, or as I decrease the actual size of the whole of the lens, right, that aperture size in the lens. So again, if I bring this up back to 1.4, this is a very, very large opening on my lens, right? And this is a very shallow depth of field. So that, again, when we talked about lenses, is why I said some of the more expensive lenses, this is a reason that people buy them, because their maximum aperture, the widest open they can go, lets a lot of light in, for one, but it also gives them a shallower depth of field. It makes the background look more blurry, which is an easy way to get separation of your subject from the background, right? Because a lot of times in photography, we talked about compositional techniques, right? You're trying to determine a focal point or trying to guide the viewer to look at something. If you have a shot like this is pretty easy. Like it's a pretty clear shot to know what the focal point is. Everything is blurry but this lady, right? So it's not very hard to know what we should be looking at. I need to get rid of these hints. Let's see if there's some way I can turn those off. I'll mess with that later. Okay, so this is an easy way. Using a lens that gives you a really wide open aperture is an easy way of isolating your subject against the background, and it's an easy way of making pictures sort of feel immediately professional, because generally speaking, these fast f-stop number lenses are more expensive, and so they feel kind of more premium. Like the image with a shallow depth of field we associate with professional photography. So that being said, if I come back in here, there's some other things that affect depth of field, right? So again, the most obvious one that people will always talk about is your aperture. When it's wider open, you have the deeper depth of field, or when it's wide open, you have the shallower depth of field, right? And then when you close it down to a small hole, a small aperture, you have this deeper depth of field. Okay, so a couple other things, though, like I say, affect that depth of field, and a big one is the distance of the subject to the camera. So this distance right here, you already saw how that affects depth of field when I started to drag the subject closer to the camera. So again, just to reiterate, when there's a smaller distance between the photographer and the subject, that depth of field becomes much, much smaller, much shallower, right? So the background becomes more blurry. Then if you start to drag the subject away, that depth of field becomes very, very broad. So if you look at any type of macro photography, so if I type in macro photography, in macro photography, your subject, like your working distance, right, between your subject and your camera is very small, right? It's something like this, right? So as soon as, which again puts these two uncomfortably close down here, but this distance right here is a common distance for macro photography, and you can see our depth of field, just looking at it visually, is tiny down here, right? So if you come and look at that, if we just look at a couple examples again of macro photography, you'll notice that these all have quite shallow depth of field, right? So we kind of talked about this before, but this frog is tiny, right? But you can see only like this eye is in focus. If you look over at this other eye, it's already getting blurry. It's already out of focus. So really our depth of field goes from like this point on this frog's nose to back here somewhere on his eye, right? So that's a very, very shallow depth of field. That's, like a half an inch or something, right? And when you're working with macro photography, a lot of times what you're trying to do is combat that shallow depth of field, and you're trying to deepen the depth of field so that you can actually have detail. Because if you tried shooting at so let's go back to this chart. So if you tried shooting macro photography with a lens wide open at something like f1.4, your depth of field would be so small that you're going to have like a portion of a hair in focus. It can get extremely difficult to even see what the picture is, because it just looks like this abstract blur. So again, if you pay attention to macro photography, you'll notice more often than not it's got very, very shallow depth of field, because it's just almost impossible not to. In fact, macro photographers use a technique called focus stacking, where they'll take a bunch of different pictures, all in focus at different depths, and then they'll combine those all together so that they can have a little bit of a, so you can see the subject and it's not just totally shallow. So the main reason I point that out is a lot of beginning photographers will think that all photography is just better with shallow depth of field. that's not necessarily the case. Like I say, sometimes you'll want a deeper depth of field, sometimes you'll want a more shallow depth of field. Again, it's just your job as a photographer to know exactly what it is you want, and then to use the tools that you have at your disposal to enact your creative vision with all the stuff that you've got to work with. So if I come back to the simulator, remember these two things, right? The distance between the photographer and the subject affects the depth of field, and the aperture setting, which technically it's called the entrance pupil, but in this class we don't get into that. For all intents and purposes, you can just remember the aperture, or the opening on the lens, affects your depth of field, and the subject to photographer distance affects your depth of field. So again, I'll say this over and over and over because it is something that is critical to understand. So apologies to those of you that already know this and are getting tired of hearing me say it. But I want to show you a couple other things too about the calculator while we're still in it. So if you look right here, so I've just been using this kind of visual to show you what this depth of field change looks like. So like you can see this, you know, the range between the blue and the orange line. But if you notice above, you also have some other numbers up top. So we have our distance that is in focus in front of the subject, like I talked about, and behind the subject. So you can look at these in actual numbers, and sometimes that'll be the more useful way to use a depth of field calculator, because sometimes it's useful to know, okay, if I have my subject and let's say she's, you know, like 3 meters away right here, then I know that at the settings I've got right here, I have 1 centimeter in focus in front, right, and 1 centimeter in focus behind the subject, right? So my depth of field here is only 2 centimeters total, right? It's a pretty shallow depth of field. So I'm going to need to be really, really particular about where I put my focus. So if you, these help things are driving me nuts. So you have a couple options again with these that we're probably not going to get into, but I encourage you all to just go into this. If we were in class, I'd actually give you guys an assignment to go mess around with this, and then I'd kind of come around and talk to you guys about it. But for today, it's not going to make sense to have me just sitting here on the stream and hoping that you guys are actually playing around with the depth of field simulator. But like I say, the link is right here, this depth of field simulator in the depth of field section, and it's worth checking out and kind of playing around with. And like I say, grab one of the apps that works on your phone to calculate this. The one that I like that does kind of a bunch of different things that we'll talk about in this class is called PhotoPills. So I'll just show you really quick what that looks like. PhotoPills. It is a paid app, but it just has so many things that it does pretty well that it's kind of the one app that I've used to replace a lot of different photography tools. So you can see this depth of field feature in this app. That basically gives you this same type of thing inside an app. Okay, so I think, like I say, for those of you that are brand new to this, go ahead and tune out right now and just, that's all you need to know to understand this. I'm going to explain one thing that's kind of a common misconception. And for those of you that are more into photography, it'll be interesting and you may already know it. For those of you that aren't, like I say, it might sound more complex and I don't want it to confuse you. So the one thing I want to chat about really quick, and you can read about it in here or watch this video. This is an excellent video by Gerald Undone on YouTube that talks about depth of field and the two factors that we just talked about that truly influence depth of field. But the thing is, there's kind of this sort of misconceived notion that your sensor size affects your depth of field, and that's not technically true, right? The depth of field doesn't change based on the size of your sensor. It's not like the lens knows what your sensor size is and it somehow adjusts itself to give you shallower depth of field. The reason that people think that a full frame camera gives you shallower depth of field than a cropped sensor camera is basically because to get the same field of view, right, so let me show you with this subject right here. So right now I'm on a full frame camera, right, and I'm shooting with, let's say, a f2 lens, and let's say we'll just leave our focal length at like 150, right, 150 millimeters. So which, by the way, this is, so 135, so this is one of my favorite lenses to shoot with, incidentally. A 135 millimeter f2 lens, it gives you a lot of separation from the background, and it's a lens that it's probably one of my top like 3 favorite lenses. because you, again, get so much, like your background becomes kind of dreamy and blurred out and just really crazy. Okay, so, but what I'm trying to show you here is that on a full frame camera with a crop of 1, right, no crop at all, 135 millimeter focal length at f2, this is what our scene looks like, right? So now if we were to go, so in fact, I wonder, let me do this. So I'm gonna just screen capture this shot so that we have that saved in memory. Okay, so now I've got a screen capture of the full frame version of this shot. So now let's come in and say, okay, let's shoot this same thing on an APS sensor. So notice right here that the top of her head is almost hitting the top of the frame, right? And that we're cropping basically at her knees, which, if you remember yesterday, we talked about not doing. So don't judge this for its artistic merit, judge it for the technical principle that we're trying to express. Okay, so if I come to APS-C, then this is what it looks like, right? But now if we were shooting this on an APS camera, we would then have to back up, right? So that she looks the same she looks the same size in the frame, right? So I can't really move I can't move him off the screen, so I'm just gonna move her back, right? So effectively, I would have to pull her back to about here, right, on the APS camera to get the same relative size of the subject on a full frame versus an APS camera. So let me take another screenshot of that and then come into Photoshop. And then, oh yeah, I left this open incidentally, really quick. I left this open just in case anybody wasn't here yesterday. I've updated the schedule to reflect that Monday we will do in-class instruction and Wednesday we'll do in-class instruction. We'll also do our presentations Monday and Wednesday. And then Tuesday, like today, we'll do these remote sessions. So again, if you're here, you probably got the message, so you probably don't need this, but FYI. Okay, so let me see if I've got both of these saved now. And if I can paste them in. Okay, so let me make that a little bit bigger so you guys can really see what's going on. So if you look at the difference between these two, you can see a couple things happen, right? So we did a pretty good job about keeping the subject about the same size, about the same relative size in the frame in both shots, right? But you can see a couple things where the actual image is looking different. So two things are happening. One, the size of the background relative to the subject looks like it changes between the two, right? Because of the different focal length. So we talked again briefly about this, and we'll talk about it more later on. But the more you zoom in, or the greater your focal length, the bigger the background elements appear relative to the subject. So because of that, when you have a tighter focal length, you see more of the background relative to the subject, and it makes the depth of field look like it's more shallow. So for that reason, you'll hear people say a longer focal length gives you a shallower depth of field. It's not necessarily that it gives you a shallower depth of field, it's that you're seeing the background bigger relative to the subject, and the background is blurry, right? So that blur looks more distinctive. But the actual depth of field, basically the amount, again, between these two lines, that depth of field is not changing, right? So practically, when you use a tighter lens, you do sort of feel like you have a shallower depth of field, because it forces you, because it makes the background look bigger relative to the subject. And you will accommodate, you'll also get closer to your subject, right, when you have that wider. So like when we shot, so let me just go back to this. So when we had our model standing here, right, to keep her head at the top and her knees right here on our APS crop, as soon as we switched to the full frame crop, then we had to get closer to the subject, right, to maintain the same crop. And as you know, the subject to photographer distance is one of the primary things that affects depth of field. So getting the subject closer to the photographer, again, reduced that depth of field, right? This width is decreasing as I drag her closer, right? So that's why on a full frame camera, you feel like you have a more shallow depth of field, because you're getting closer to the subject to make them fill the frame, which is reducing your depth of field. So like I say, that's kind of a lot to take in if you've never heard of depth of field, but if you have, then just again know that for a college level class, you probably should know that there are really only two things that affect depth of field: subject distance, right, which we've talked about at length now, and entrance pupil or aperture diameter opening, which we'll explain more what this F number means when we get into exposure. Okay, so that's probably all we need to discuss on depth of field for now. Hopefully that makes sense. We're going to look at a couple pictures now, and I think just looking at it in real life application will help you understand it a little bit better if you don't. But the concept is not a difficult one. Just remember, as your depth of field gets extremely shallow, your focus has to be more precise, right? So if you have somebody if you're shooting a portrait of somebody and their eye is out of focus, right? We usually, like I said before, we gravitate towards looking at someone's eyes to be able to read what they're thinking and saying and communicating. So if you have somebody's eyes out of focus, a lot of times it's going to look off. So the general rule of thumb is, like, if I'm looking to you like this eye is closer to the camera than this one. So this is the eye you want to focus on. So at some of these distances where your depth of field is getting really, really shallow, remember to focus on the eye closest to the camera. So if I were to show you guys in this example right here, the background, all this stuff back here, is not terribly blurry, right? Because I wanted to do this demonstration of giving you that visual of what the sensor vignetting looks like, I used this crop sensor lens, right? I usually don't use it because it's slow. It's a kit lens, and I can't open it up to a really wide aperture, and I can't get a lot of blur on the background. But I could get a blurry background if I were closer to the camera. So if I put my hand up here, for example, if I can get the camera to focus on it, which works with my other lens, it doesn't look like it wants to with this one. Yeah, it's not loving that. So with my other lens, if I do that, it'll focus on my hand. And then you'll notice everything behind it gets really, really blurry because, again, the close focus distance, right, means that you have the narrow subject to photographer distance, right? In this case, my hand being the subject, it means you get a really blurry background because you have a shallow depth of field. So hopefully that makes sense. I wish this would focus for me, but it doesn't look like it wants to. Come on. Yeah, it's not going to autofocus. Okay. Just believe me on that one then. So let me jump back to this and we'll take a look at a couple pictures. Okay, so we'll just, I don't know, start. Actually, let's look at these. So this would be a deeper depth of field, right? You can see in this case we're showing a room, right? So the room is the subject, right? This is an event center, so we want to see the entirety of the shot. We don't necessarily want chairs in the foreground to be in focus and then chairs in the background to trail out of focus. So if I zoom in, you'll see exactly how deep or shallow the depth of field is, but you can see back here, these are still pretty sharp, and these ones up here are pretty similarly sharp, right? So the depth of field is pretty even across this entire shot. You can see a lot of stuff, and it's basically all in focus. So this would be a shot with a deep depth of field. And then if we contrast that with this shot, ironically in the same place, this has a shallow depth of field, right? You can see the subject is in focus, right? Her eye, if I zoom in here. Okay, so focus is placed on her eye, on this eye closest to camera, which I don't know how well you can tell it in YouTube, but this eye is totally sharp, and then this eye back here is actually starting to trail out of focus. So this area on her left eye starts to become a little bit soft. Let me just check the stream to see how well you guys can see that. Okay, so I think it's probably pretty visible. So if you look at like some of the hair and stuff as well on the side of her head here, you'll notice that this is getting quite blurry, right? This is a very shallow depth of field. So again, portrait stuff, a lot of times it's beneficial to use a more shallow depth of field because, like, when I shot this, I wanted it to be very clear this is the subject, right? And I wanted a lot of separation from the background. So if I were to look at the image information for this shot, so if you look over here on the right hand side, you can see my F number, which again is an indicator of my aperture, is at 1.7, right? So that means that this is very wide open, right? This lens is very, very open aperture. And then shutter speed is this other number here, which is sort of inconsequential for what we're talking about right now, but just so you're aware, this is our aperture, and then this is our shutter speed. So, and there's a lot of other information in this. So this is Bridge, by the way, Adobe Bridge. This is just a program Adobe makes that's sort of like Finder on a Mac. So this is Finder, right, a file explorer. This is the same type of thing, just that it's designed to work specifically with media. So it gives you a lot of really cool tools to navigate media and to sort and filter by different parameters. So if I come down here and look at this EXIF data, this is a certain type of metadata or just information that's stored with a photo file. And you can see the focal length of this shot says 57 millimeters. And then this specific image was taken with a cropped sensor camera. So if you look right here, I took this with a Sony a6500. So that 57 millimeters that you see down here, that was what the actual focal length was. But if you remember, the crop factor is about 1.5. So if you multiply 57 by 1.5, you should get this 85 millimeters. So the effective focal length of this image is 85 millimeters at f1.8, and that's a really, really common kind of portrait situation. So if you care, this was taken with the Sigma lens. I kind of told you guys there's some really awesome Sigma lenses. So the 50 to 100 millimeter 1.8 is what this was shot with. It has an issue where through an adapter it relays the aperture as a tenth of a stop brighter than it actually is. So for those of you that know that lens, the 50 to 100, it's not actually an f1.7 lens. Don't be confused about that. Okay, so hopefully that kind of clears up some ideas of what depth of field means. So if you look at some shots like this, you can see this shot right here has this kind of annoying abstract shape in the front. This is just more foliage in the front of the lens that's not in focus because it's so close to the camera. And if this had been shot with a deeper depth of field, you'd be able to make out more what that is, right? Which wasn't something I wanted when I shot that. Here's a shallow depth of field, right? Which in this case, it's about, creating this sense of privacy for the couple in the background. So it's focused on these random juniper berries or whatever this stuff is. Where again, this isn't necessarily the focal point of the image. I mean, this kind of gets into debate about where your focal point is here. It's designed to indicate a mood, right? A mood of kind of privacy, like I said before. So keeping them blurred and then having our focus here is using shallow depth of field as an artistic tool. So again, even though sometimes the explanations of this stuff seem a little bit technical, especially at the beginning of this term, as we're sort of learning about it and not applying it, as you go to apply this stuff and you change your aperture and you see the effect it has on depth of field, you'll start to realize how it can become intuitive and you'll stop even thinking about it. But like I say, use the tools that we're talking about as artistic, creative choices rather than just thinking of them as technical exercises. So I think, let's see, 446, that's probably about all I want to say about depth of field. Again, if you notice a lot of these where you see a really shallow depth of field, a lot of them are telephoto lenses because, again, the telephoto lens will exaggerate the size of the background. And so suddenly the out of focus stuff looks really large relative to the foreground. So again, in this case, this is one of those where having a depth of field calculator can be fairly helpful because I want both of her eyes in focus here, right? I want her to be sort of completely in focus, but then I want everything behind her to be out of focus and everything in front of her to be out of focus. So for this specific shot, I didn't use a depth of field calculator because it was just a random shot in the backyard with my kids. So it wasn't something I pull out a depth of field calculator for. I'm not quite that lame. But it's one of those things where if I was shooting it professionally, I may or may not actually go to the phone or to the web browser and figure out how deep my depth of field is going to be, so I don't have any surprises when I go to shoot it. A lot of this stuff will become intuitive with practice. The more you do it, the more you'll just get a sense for what a certain focal length is going to feel like and a certain focal length and aperture combination, and you'll just kind of intuitively know about what your depth of field will be. So you don't have to necessarily memorize a certain set of parameters and how your depth of field is going to relate to them. So the last thing I want to talk about, since we are talking about focus, is hyperfocal distance. If you guys remember at the bottom of this, we saw these numbers for in front of subject and then behind subject. And then we had this last parameter that was called hyperfocal distance. So the hyperfocal distance is important when you're trying to maximize your depth of field. So if you're trying to shoot for something to get everything in focus, you want to focus at the hyperfocal distance, because it means that at that point and everything behind it, it's going to be in focus. So if you're doing a landscape shot and you want to focus on a rock in the foreground but then have the mountains in the background also be totally in focus, then the hyperfocal distance can give you the minimum focus distance, right? The closest that you can focus and still have everything at infinity be in focus. Okay, so that being said, it's one of those things, again, that you can pull out an app and you can find the hyperfocal distance of your lens. Let's actually demonstrate this practically, because I think that might help explain it. So if I come over here, it's going to be the hyperfocal distance of our lens is going to be a little bit sort of impractical at 180 millimeters. So like I say, usually when you're using this, you're shooting at really wide focal lengths because it's more kind of landscape photography type stuff. So if I pull this back to something like 24 millimeters, right, which is quite wide, a lot of lenses that you buy that are zoom lenses designed to be kind of all-purpose lenses, the widest they will go is 24 millimeters. So a 24 to 70 millimeter focal length is kind of a really common, just average kind of run around shooting events or weddings or whatever lens. So at 24 millimeters, if I'm trying to get a shot of Paris here that is totally in focus, then this says I need to set my hyperfocal distance at 9.93 meters, right? So basically at 10 meters away. So if you watch me move my subject to 10 meters, so here's my subject, here's 10 meter mark, watch what happens to this entire span, left to right, of depth of field as I approach 10 meters. So I'm pulling the subject back and back and back and back, and then you'll notice as soon as I hit this 9.93 mark, which is going to be about in here, right, then I have this entire thing in focus, a very deep depth of field, which again is perfect for landscape stuff because I want to see all of this stuff in the frame. So this, I think, is probably the easiest way to understand hyperfocal distance. Just drag your subject around, right, and you'll notice that the depth of field is getting deeper and deeper and deeper until a certain point at which you hit infinity. So you'll notice this infinity sign over here, the sideways 8. All that infinity is saying is that stuff at infinity, right, is completely in focus, so that even space behind it is going to be totally in focus. So that's the gist of the hyperfocal distance. Not terribly complex, but it can seem a little weird, I guess, because it's a technical sounding word. Okay, so we had a question about manual focus. That is not a dumb question, Olivia. So manually focusing, I'll give you kind of a broader answer to your question. We will go over the different, in fact, if you look here in the lessons, we do go over focus in camera operation. So in camera operation, we talk about manual focus versus autofocus. For the sake of this right now, none of this matters if you're autofocusing versus manually focusing, right? Like it's going to give you the same result either way. The depth of field will be the same if the camera achieved focus for you or if you manually set the lens to focus on that specific point. So actually manually focusing, as far as when you'd use one versus the other, I don't know if that's part of your question at all, but a lot of situations where you're actually explicitly figuring out your depth of field or your hyperfocal distance like this, in a lot of those situations you will be manually focusing, just because those are scenarios where you have enough time to actually set up your shot. So if you're doing event photography, again, like if you're going to shoot a wedding or a bar mitzvah or whatever type of thing you're shooting, then you're probably not going to be like, wait, like, don't kiss the bride, let me pull out my depth of field calculator and ascertain the correct amount of depth of field, right? You're going to hopefully have done it enough that you know about what you want your camera settings to be. So in those run and gun cases, you'll always be using autofocus. But in these landscape photography type situations, again, you'll be calculating the depth of field more precisely, perhaps. It's not like you have to, it's just one more tool to help you get a plannable, kind of predictable result. But in those cases, a lot of times you will be manually focusing. And one other thing that I want to show you is when you're trying to determine how this focus works, there's kind of a general rule of thumb that can be really helpful when you're trying to maximize your depth of field, and that is that your focus will generally be, you'll have more in focus behind the image plane that's in focus, right, behind the subject, than you will in front of. So in this case, this rule isn't perfect, but if you start to pick kind of a little bit more average focal length, it'll sort of look a little bit more accurate to what I'm saying. So the rule is this: your focus exists from this image plane of perfect focus 1/3 in front of that image plane and 2/3 behind. So your entire depth of field is if you subdivide it into thirds, so imagine the rule of thirds that we talked about, then 1/3 of that depth of field lies in front of the subject, 2/3 of that depth of field lies behind the subject. And again, the reason that can be useful is because if you're trying to maximize your focus, right, if you're shooting something in macro photography like this spider, then you want to know exactly where to put that specific focus point so that you get whatever part of the spider you want to be in focus, right? Because in this case, you've only got like I don't know, like 1/2 centimeter or something here to work with focus-wise. So if you wanted, for example, the eyes to be the focus plane, then that means you're going to have a little bit more in focus behind than you are in front of that point you're focusing on. So yeah, so bear that in mind. Again, I like to teach it with this simulator because it's just so easy to see the photographer, the subject, and then the depth of field all in one, and to play with them interactively. So I'll give you guys a few seconds in case you had any questions about depth of field to shout them out in the chat. Thanks for posting a question, Olivia. Yeah, but that's pretty much all we'll talk about with depth of field. Once we talk about aperture and f-stops, we'll bring it up again. But again, for now, just remember on your camera, which you should know how to use fairly well by now, set it to a smaller f number, and that will give you a shallower depth of field. And if you have like a professional DSLR type camera, your aperture control on most of those is going to be like right here. So you can see on this Canon 5D, my index finger has an aperture ring right here. So as I scroll that, I can either close down or open up the aperture depending which way I scroll that. And again, it's going to be shown to me on the camera as an F number. So this, in fact, let me try this. We'll see if this works. So I hooked up another camera to see if it would look any better. The quality of it is kind of terrible. Let me try this really quick though. See if you guys can see this at all. Okay, so this right here is the aperture number, that 13, right? So this would be this lens right here will go up to f1.8, so that's wide open, and then I can stop all the way down quite a bit farther. But again, for the purposes of depth of field, get that number to be really small and you'll have a shallow depth of field. Not much will be in focus. Okay, and it's ironic that we're talking about focus and this webcam is not focused on the camera, but hopefully it's enough that you guys can see it. Okay, so again, hopefully that makes sense. We'll leave depth of field there for now because I want to spend the rest of the time talking about more of the Photoshop stuff, especially since you guys do have your assignments due tomorrow. So in case anybody has forgotten, let me jump back to this. Let's take a look at Canvas really quickly. And here's the calendar. So this late work form, again, is sort of a simplistic assignment, but I want you to take a picture of the form itself with the camera you'll be using for this class. Thanks to those of you that already submitted this. And I want to just go over really quick the entire image processing pipeline for those of you that have never done any of this stuff, just to make sure you feel comfortable being able to get the JPEG that I talked about, requiring the JPEG image format. Just to make sure you feel good getting a JPEG out of the camera and to me. So you can either go into the camera and just make sure its settings themselves are set to JPEG. Then you can just take the picture and send it. You don't have to worry about anything. But if you have a professional camera and you shot in a RAW format, I wanted to talk about just really, really quickly what that workflow is. So, yeah, and then while we're here too on the calendar, don't forget to do this choosing a camera quiz, which again usually would be over here on this Friday the 17th, but because we didn't have Canvas, it's bumped down to here. Just don't forget to take that by midnight tomorrow, because it will close at midnight and then you won't be able to take it anymore. Okay, so let me come into this. Let's come back into Bridge and we'll talk about this. So a couple things. If you look at this, inside Bridge, you'll notice all of these have file extensions, right? So this image is called img_2642.cr2. So that dot CR2, that's just the file extension, right? It's the stuff that comes after this dot. That's just telling me essentially what type of file it is, right? So if I come back to this shot on the left, you'll notice this has .jpeg, right? So that's a JPEG format. You don't have to know this, but that's Joint Picture Experts Group. It's a really common image format that if you've ever done anything with images, then you'll have run across JPEG. I mean, even if you haven't done anything with images, this is a compressed format that is so ubiquitous that if you've ever been on the internet, you've seen JPEGs. So this, in fact, let's look at a couple things. So this is the same shot, right? If I go back and forth between these two, they're similar, not identical. It's the same shot, but this one has been modified and colored, whereas this is the raw file from the camera. So in this colored shot, if I were to come over here to the right side of the screen, you can see this is 7.41 megabytes, right? This JPEG for the native resolution that that camera shoots at, right? Whereas if I just go over to this shot now, this is 28 megabytes, right? So the difference in file size between this 7.41 and this 28, which is pretty substantial, right? 4 and a little bit times larger on the raw format. That's one of the biggest things to be aware of when you're shooting raw in your camera versus JPEG. Again, we'll talk about that later, but since I had these two shots, I just kind of wanted to point that out. So in this case, I could take this image, it's a JPEG image, I could email that to somebody, I could text it to somebody. It's, again, JPEG is supported all across the world, everywhere. It's not a proprietary format, but this CR2 is a proprietary format. This is a Canon specific raw format, meaning Canon has a bunch of smart image science they do to create this format, and then it has to be processed in a certain way to get it to look like what you want it to look like, and then saved out to a format like JPEG if you want to share it with other people. Okay, so if I double click on this from Bridge, right, again, we're inside Adobe Bridge, then it's going to open up, or I could right click on this and say reveal in Finder, right? So if you had a memory card that you just plugged in to your, oh, hopefully this doesn't crash on me. Let me do this really quick. It must have, so if this crashes because it's out of application memory, we'll end class there. I'm hoping it isn't going to do that for us. So, okay, so we'll see how long this gives us. Hopefully it doesn't actually crash it. So when I'm streaming, I think the combination of having the streaming application open must have a cache somewhere, and it's filling up my hard drive. So like I say, it could just, it'll terminate and you guys will know if it does, but we'll press on until then. Okay, so inside Finder or inside Bridge, you'll see these CR2 files, right? So that's what I was trying to point out, is that you could open up your camera card inside Finder or inside Explorer if you're on a PC, and you could just open it directly from there. It doesn't matter how you open your file, either way is going to give you the same result. So when you open that file, it's going to have to open it with a special piece of software to even be able to deal with this raw file format. And so let me do this really quickly. Let's take just a couple minute break, and I'm going to try and delete a couple things just because I don't, if I open this image in Photoshop, it's going to push this past the limit of what it's going to love, and then it might just crash on us. So take like a 4-minute break, and then which should be nice since you guys are all in the comforts of your home, right? And then you guys can come back in just a few minutes. I'm going to delete a couple things, and then hopefully we won't have issues with this. So give me just a second. Okay, so hopefully everybody's back. This should be working fine for us. I shouldn't risk running out of application memory now. So 505, yeah, so let's jump back into this. And again, if you've got questions about anything, shout them out in the comments. Hopefully somebody is still out there listening. So this CR2 file is a proprietary format. If I double click on it, then it's going to open Photoshop. You can see Photoshop popped up here in the upper left, so I know on a Mac that is the active application, but I have this separate window here now, right? So this separate window is a whole different application, basically, and it's called Adobe Camera Raw. So Adobe Camera Raw, sorry, I'm trying not to burp into the microphone. I just got a big drink of water because I was so tired of talking. So Camera Raw is a separate application made by Adobe that is basically like the raw image processing application that deals with all these hundreds of types of third-party raw formats and lets Photoshop open them. So Photoshop itself can't really read this CR2 file. This CR2 file, we might talk about this later, but it's a Bayer pattern image that's raw data from the camera. It's not actually an image that software like Photoshop or anybody, like I said before, can read. So this Adobe Camera Raw, or ACR as you'll see it abbreviated, the acronym, it's basically the tool that lets us pick all the raw settings we want to change and then have adapted into something like a JPEG, right? Something like a normal image that Photoshop can work with. So that's what this window is. This window is Adobe Camera Raw giving us all these parameters that we can adjust on the raw photo. So interestingly enough, if I come into Lightroom, right? Lightroom is another photo manipulation piece of software by Adobe. If I were to come into Lightroom, I could pick any one of these shots and then do the similar type of thing if I hit develop up here. Right? So if I were to come into develop, I have all of these controls along here, which you'll notice actually look surprisingly similar to all of the controls that I have here inside Photoshop. So the reality of this is that Adobe Camera Raw engine drives both of these applications. There's no difference in developing inside Lightroom versus developing inside Bridge. We might talk about workflow a little bit more later on when we actually get to it in the course, so I'll kind of go over this again. But for right now, you don't even have to use either of these applications at all. I'm just trying to use them to show you that opening up an image, a raw image, inside Photoshop is going to give you. Let me respond to these just a second, you guys. I've got a couple questions from people who aren't able to get in, so let me just hurry and respond to those. I don't know why they're all coming in at once now. It's not good. Okay, let me just see if we've got any more. Let's go to inbox. Okay, I think that's everybody. Okay. So that CR2 file, again, you're going to have to open using Adobe Camera Raw to get Photoshop to even read it. So if you want to mess with all of this stuff, go ahead and do it. These are all pretty intuitive. They change what they sound like they would change. We'll go over them in a lot more detail when we talk about workflow stuff. But for now, I'm trying to just show you more of the whole process of getting an image into Photoshop, messing with it, and then getting it saved out. This texture one, by the way, is new. If you guys haven't downloaded the update within the last week to the Adobe stuff, then you won't have this texture slider. But yeah, so if I take all of this stuff, and then there's some different parameters down here that we'll talk about later for how we're going to open it up inside Photoshop, but for now we'll just hit open image. So now this is no longer a CR2 Canon file, right? This is now something that can be displayed on a monitor. It's a normal, I'll just call it a normal image. It's debayered, which again we'll talk about later. But now I need to get this into a JPEG so I can save it to Canvas, right? So there's lots of ways you can do this. The way that you used to do it was this save for web option inside Photoshop. So you can see in parentheses it says legacy. That's not the way Adobe likes you to do it anymore. They like this export as dialog. So if you come into export as, this is kind of the best way to export nowadays. If you change this to JPG, then you'll now have a JPEG image you can save out at whatever compression level you want to. If you leave it at about 70 or 80%, that's generally pretty good for just sharing with people. And then you can change the size of the image if you want to. But for the purposes of just submitting your form for the assignment that's due tomorrow night, go ahead and just, you could really leave these on whatever you want to. But for most purposes, saving it out as a JPEG at about 70%. If you want it to be something that's kind of general purpose, you can save it out at about like 1920 on the width, because that'll work well on a phone and decently in a browser. But again, we'll kind of talk about this stuff later. So if I hit export all, then this gives me the little dialog where I can choose where on my hard drive to save it. That will be a JPEG file, and that will be universally readable, and you can upload that to Canvas to fulfill the assignment. Okay, so that's basically all you need to know workflow wise. And then again, we'll talk about a lot more of it in detail, a lot about like how you adjust these settings. Again, like I said, how you copy and paste them between different images, how they're stored on a hard drive, how Bridge and Lightroom differ. We'll get into all of that a little bit later, but for now, hopefully this gives you a really high level look at how to take your image from your camera's memory card and save a JPEG that you could submit to Canvas. So let's do this. It's 5:12. I told you guys that for participation points, I'd give you some way to actually relate that you participated in class. So go ahead and just send me a message through Canvas with the word aperture. That'll force you guys to look up how to spell aperture. So send me a message through Canvas by 5:30 that says aperture, and then I'll give you guys participation points for sticking it out through the entire thing today. And I wanted to go over some Photoshop stuff while we were doing this, specifically layers, masks and layers. I don't think we quite have enough time to get into all of that, so I think I'll probably just close what we're talking about today, and we'll call it good here. And then I'll leave the last kind of 10 minutes. I'll stick around, and then if anybody has any questions they want to ask in the chat, I can respond to specific questions, and we'll get into some of the layer stuff and layer masking probably tomorrow, depending on if we get through some of the rest of the stuff. So looks like you guys are sending your messages in. So again, if you're still here, send me a message that says aperture, just that one word, and I'll give you guys points for participating today. But yeah, send any final questions you have, and anybody else, you're good to sign off. Thanks for coming. Okay, doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I'm signing off. Thanks for coming. Hasta la next time.